Hi there, thanks for joining me in this watermelon glaze painting kit. Let's find out how it all works. When you're ready to get started, you'll want to make sure that you put your papers down to protect your tabletop. The glazes are water-based, which means they're really easy to clean up off of your table or even off of your clothes, but it is a good idea just to protect your surface a little bit. And we're gonna start by painting the red glaze on the inside of our bowl for the watermelon effect. And you'll notice I don't dip my whole paintbrush in the paint. We don't need to get the paint way up top here, just on the bristles. And we're gonna smooth it in and get one nice even coat of paint all the way on the inside. This fan brush is nice. It keeps things nice and smooth. Now you'll notice I got a little bit on the edge here. That's gonna be okay because we'll clean that up in the end with the sponge that was also in your kit. I'm gonna try not to get too much up there because in the end, it is gonna get erased. Ooh, you'll notice that I turn the bowl to make sure that I can get a good angle with my brush. It's totally okay to move your ceramic piece around to get just the right angle. And you see how that little spot right there is kind of thick? I'm gonna make it a little bit thinner. It'll have an easier time to dry if I make it nice and flat and smooth. And while we're looking at this, you can tell the difference in colors from the areas that are dry versus the areas that are wet. We want to make sure that before we put on our next layer, before we put on the next coat, that our paint is nice and dry like this lighter color. So we're gonna wait a little bit while we let this dry before we get our next coat on. That didn't take too much time at all for that first layer to dry. I'm ready to go in with the second layer. This is all about taking your time, having fun, getting a little relaxing in. These layers will ensure that our color is going to be nice and bright and solid. We want our watermelon to look delicious. So we're getting layer number 2 on here. For our final little bit, we want to make sure we have at least 3 layers, possibly even 4. If we're making them nice and flat like this, 4 might be a good idea. And look at that, just while I was talking with you, I was able to get layer number 2 done. We're gonna wait for this to dry. While I waited for that layer to dry, I did some jumping jacks. What did you do while you were waiting for your layer to dry? This would be like a fun, I don't know, like nighttime activity, like before bed. It's rather relaxing. That'll do it for my layer number 3. Time for some more of those jumping jacks. Layer number 3 is looking pretty good. Time to get on layer number 4, which is our last layer. So enjoy your time with this red glaze. All right, that's looking nice and smooth and flat, and I've got my 4th layer on here to dry. And during this break, I can wash this paintbrush because we won't be painting with the red glaze anymore. Before I start on the other side of my bowl, I kind of want to take a look at my surrounding area, and I noticed that there was a little bit of a red dot on my page, and I swiped it and moved it out of the way, or you can kind of wash it off or use the other side of the page or maybe your secondary page. So what we don't want is to get this red paint on the other side of our bowl. This is where our green paint is gonna go. And since we're gonna flip this over, we're gonna take a look at what we've got on the outside and make sure that there isn't any red. So do a little quality control. Make sure there isn't any red on this side of the bowl because that's where we want the green to go. And if you did happen to get a little bit of red on your bowl, we've got this handy solution and we're gonna clean it up a little bit. Oh, look at this. This is the bowl that we're gonna be creating. It's a little sneak peek. You might not have this exact bowl at home, but you've got something that you can use to put a little bit of water in it, and you've got the sponge from your kit. And we're gonna wanna get the sponge wet, but not soaking wet. So I'm gonna squeeze this so most of the water comes out, and it's just gonna be a damp sponge to be able to then clean an area that might have gotten a little bit of that glaze on it. And it'll clean right off, and we'll be ready to go once this dries up a little bit, and we can get the green glaze going. All right, the green glaze gets a turn, and we've got a whole new fan brush this time. So we're gonna use the second fan brush for our green paint. And again, I'm just dipping in just the bristles of the paint and gonna get my first layer on here. Remember, this is the layer that dries the quickest. Yet you can move your bowl around, or you might even choose to twist your page around to get to an area that you haven't painted yet. Make it nice and easy to paint this. Anytime a spot looks to be a little bit thick with paint, kind of move that paint into a new area so that it flattens out for us. Just to get a clearer look at this, you'll notice that I'm getting a little bit of paint on the paper, which is a-okay. It's just helping me make sure I get the paint on the bowl all the way to the edge. We don't want to miss a spot. Make sure you do a double check and go around your bowl. See that you've gotten one nice layer on here. Ooh, I've spied something. These are little brush hairs or little bristles from the brush. I'm just gonna take these out. If they happen to get stuck in the paint, that'll be a-okay. They'll just burn off in the kiln. Layer number one always takes less time to dry, so I'm ready for layer number two. Working just the same as before. And since I mentioned the kiln, I can tell you a little bit about that. These pieces will end up getting fired in the kiln at the studio once you're all done with your piece. And that kiln works a little bit like an oven where it gets super duper hot to cook something. In this case, it's cooking your bisque piece or your ceramic piece. And it's gonna transform these glaze paints into something like glass. It's gonna get extra shiny, and it's gonna even change the color of the glaze. And then when it gets out of the kiln and it cools, because it has to cool down from its 2,500 degree temperature, once it's all cool, you'll be ready to pick it up. And then you can have all sorts of delicious snacks and treats in this bowl. It will be dishwasher and microwave safe, which is super handy. You could fill it with cereal or fruits or vegetables or ice cream. Layer number two is all nice and dry. Coming back in with our glaze for layer number three. Go around, check it out, make sure you like what you're seeing. You've got that layer three all nice and covered. Maybe for this break, it's time for a snack. Now that layer number three is dry, we can come in for layer number four. This is our last layer of the light green. all those good spots. Don't forget the edges. We want to make sure that we get nice coverage of our glaze on here to make it nice and bright and shiny. I've used up pretty much all of my glaze, so I know that I've got some good layers of light green on here. I'm gonna let this dry while I clean my brush. All right, my light green layer is dry and I've brought over my dark green paint and the sponge, because next up is a little bit of detail to make our watermelon look extra realistic and have some stripes. Now this layer is a little bit different than the other ones because we only have to do one layer this time. And we're gonna start by making a stripe that goes from one side all the way to the other. So one full stripe all the way across. And I'm gonna pinch my sponge so that I get kind of a narrow stripe. So when I leave the sponge regular size, the stripe will be a little bit too thick, but if I pinch it, it gets a little bit smaller, and that's about the size that I want. And I'm gonna dip my sponge in the paint. And now I've got a little bit of paint on there, and I'm gonna pick to start my stripe just in this area so that I can kind of get it to go. And I'm kind of jumping up and down, bouncing like a bunny. And I'm gonna hop, hop, hop all the way across. And you'll notice I kind of twist my hand as I go so that the pattern is a little bit different, but still following that line. And I'm going all the way down to the side. Hop, 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 hop. Get a little more glaze, and this time I'm hopping all the way down the other side. This gives our watermelon some texture and some awesome visual interest. You'll notice that the edges are not perfectly straight. They have a little bit of extra color going this way and that. All right, time to make stripe number 2 for our watermelon. Because I like to make this nice and easy for myself, I turned my pot to a different angle so that it's easier for me to reach. So again, I'm gonna pinch my sponge, and I'm gonna start at the top so I kind of get my crisscross line. So now I have one stripe that goes top to bottom, and my new stripe is gonna go side to side because I turned my bowl. Just makes it a little bit easier for me to see while I'm working. Hop, hop, hop. Again, just one layer. And then once your sponge starts to look like it doesn't have enough paint on it, you'll go in for a little bit more. You get to decide how this texture is going to look. Okay, I think I like the way that's going. This time I'm turning it, but only a little bit so that my next stripe goes in between those other 2 stripes. So I'm coming all the way across. So again, squeeze my sponge. And your fingers might get a little bit messy, and that's okay. We can wash our hands in the end. But while we're working, it's totally all right to get a little bit messy. And this is all about how you feel comfortable working. If you'd like to move your base, your paper, so that you can get a good angle, go for it. And this is going to be different for everybody, so yours isn't going to look exactly like mine. Every watermelon gets to be unique. Okay, so I've got 3 full stripes and I'm ready for my 4th one. Ooh, this watermelon bowl is all about the number 4. Try not to let my stripes get too thick. I'm making sure to squeeze my sponge so that the width of the sponge stays a bit narrow. Now I'm just going in and making sure All of these edges I'm super satisfied with, especially at the bottom here. I want to make sure that I like the look of the textures, the edges, that I didn't miss a spot. All right, I like the way that's looking. I'm gonna wait for this dark green layer to dry up a little bit before I work on the next step. During this break, it might be a good idea to wash out this sponge. When this layer dries, it's a good idea to take out the pencil that was in your kit and write your name on the bottom of the bowl. You don't want it to be too tiny. Make sure that the letters are big enough for us to trace over with a paintbrush. And if you notice that the pencil etches or digs into the paint a little bit, that's okay. We'll still be able to see it and the kiln will make it a-okay. I've got my name on the bottom of the bowl and I flipped over my page so that I'm working on a fresh new surface so that no maybe happen to be wet bits of paint get onto the bowl where I didn't want them to be. And now I'm bringing over my black glaze. Now the black glaze is super special because it only requires one layer, but it also means that it's a very potent. So we want to be very careful when we're using the black paint on this. And we're gonna bring back over one of our fan brushes and I'm just gonna dry it off a little bit on a towel or rag that I happen to have. You could use a paper towel to dry it off, just so that the water doesn't run down the paintbrush if it happens to still be a little wet. Now this technique is pretty cool. We're going to dip the back of our paintbrush in the black paint. And then, I'm gonna do a little sample off of the bowl, and it might help to do a little bit of practicing out of your bowl as well, just so you see how this technique works. So one dip into the black paint cup, and then a dot on the page makes for a perfect circle. Every time you go to make a dot, you're gonna wanna dip back into your paint cup. Now, the shape of a watermelon seed is a little bit different than a perfect polka dot, although you could totally use just this circle dot shape. If you'd like the shape of your watermelon seed to be a little bit more realistic, you're gonna wanna dot, leave it there, and go up and down just a little bit. That way our shape is a little bit transformed. So a dot and up and down just a little bit. So it's a little, I don't know, ovally shaped. You get to decide how you want to make your watermelon seeds. All right, time to get these details into our bowl. Now the technique is going to be about doing a little bit of spacing here. So we don't want these watermelon seeds to sit right on top of each other. So we're gonna be a little bit conscious about moving the seeds about the bowl. Watermelons have different sized seeds. Sometimes they grow at different rates. So you could have some bigger seeds, some smaller seeds. Just remember to dip inside that glaze every time you make a new dot, every time you make a new seed. If you're not quite happy with the shape of one of your seeds, you could transform it a little bit, but move slowly because we don't want our seeds to get too big. This part takes some time and some patience. If you feel like you need to take a little break in between, that's totally okay. Don't rush this part. These are the great details that make it look like a true watermelon. I'm rotating the bowl every time I make a new seed. That way I have just the right angle for me. You'll have to decide what makes you most comfortable in making these super fun tiny seeds. You get to decide how many seeds you place in here. Take a look around, see if you feel like there's maybe too big of a gap in between a few of the seeds. You might want to add another one. And when you feel like you've got them all in there, you'll want to wash off the other end of your paintbrush. Let's say you got some black paint where you didn't want it to be, either on the outside or the inside or what have you. Anywhere you want to remove some of the black paint, you're gonna use the back of the paintbrush to scrape it up and then wipe it off little by little. Go slowly. And if you want to, you can add a little bit of the red paint as like a repair. So it's kind of like fixing it, covering it up after you've taken off that black glaze. You don't want the black glaze to be underneath the red glaze. You'll see it. If you get it into a bigger area or it's feeling a little overwhelming, feel free to send us a message and we can walk you through some steps or even help you out at the studio. Now we're going to deal with the edge or the rim of our bowl, and we're going to create a rind. And a rind is the layer of the watermelon that is in between the green and the red stuff. And you don't want to eat the rind. The rind is yucky, but it definitely is helpful to get our watermelon to look like a watermelon. Just more of those details to make it look like the real thing. Now I have my handy bowl out again, and the sponge is really wet when it's sitting inside the water. And we don't want it to be that wet when we bring it over to our glazed watermelon bowl. If it gets too wet, these glaze colors can drip in there and it's gonna ruin all the work that we did and all the details that we did. So we wanna squeeze that sponge really hard, maybe even test it out, make sure it's working well. Squeeze the sponge so we get most of the water out. We only want it to be like a damp sponge. We don't want it to be too wet. And we're gonna take our sponge and rub the outside edge, and it's going to remove some of that glaze. And I'm actually twisting my sponge so that a new area of the sponge can remove the glaze. I'm gonna turn my area here and maybe even use a different spot of the sponge. I can turn the sponge sideways, and I'm removing a little bit of glaze at a time. I don't want to transfer this glaze to a new spot on the bowl, so I'm making sure that I have a clear area or a clean area of the sponge that I'm using to remove the glaze. And there's lots of sides to the sponge, so I'm just twisting and turning the sponge, getting a good angle. And if I've run out of areas, I can always rinse out the sponge in the bowl. It's gonna change the water a little bit. That's okay. We're just cleaning our sponge. And again, I'm getting pretty much all that water. I'm using a lot of muscles to squeeze out that sponge. And then with the damp sponge, I can keep coming back and deciding if I need to remove some more of the glaze and expose more of the rind. If your hands get a little wet, you might want a little towel or rag nearby to dry them off before you're touching another spot of the bowl. Now I noticed I smeared a little bit of my seed. So I'm gonna bring back over my bowl with the water and the sponge. And I'm gonna squeeze out all of that water. So it's just a damp sponge. I'm gonna wipe just a little bit, not too much because you don't want the red to go away too much, but a little bit so that the black smear goes away. And then you'll wanna take a look with clean and dry hands. I have a little rag that's nearby. You wanna take a look at your entire piece to make sure that there aren't any spots that you'd like to clean up. And if there are, you can use that sponge to do it. When you are super satisfied with the way that your piece looks and it's all clean, neat, and tidy, you'll want to bring this back to the studio along with your sponges and your brushes. So this all comes back to the studio. Thanks so much for joining me. I can't wait for you to see your final glazed piece when it comes out of the kiln. Sneak peek.